For the recording, I want to announce what most of you already know. This is Monday, April 9th. It is 5 minutes after 1. You are in panel number 1208, and the panel title is Pathways to Juvenile Justice. My name is Susie Adjutant. I'm going to be moderating the panel. I have the pleasure of doing that. And it's particularly of interest to me because my own professional work has been involved in juvenile justice. I was part of a national study on juvenile delinquency and drug abuse that went on for many, many years. And I have continued to work during my, my volunteer time in Colorado, serving for 5 years on the Colorado State Juvenile Parole Board. So I'm very interested to hear what our panelists have to say about this important topic. We're going to follow what I think for most of you is a fairly standard procedure. Each of the panelists will have about 10 minutes to make opening comments on the topic of their choosing based upon their experience and their professional involvement in juvenile justice. And then I'm going to allow them a little time if they want to interact with each other based upon what they've heard from their colleagues, because some of them know each other well and others do not know each other well. Then I will open it up for questions. And before I do that, I will point out how we're going to do that. We have a new way of allowing you to ask questions this year. So let me start, before we get going, by introducing our four panelists. To my far right is James Bell. He has worked for many years in U.S. jurisdictions as well as internationally to address equity in justice systems, especially for children and youth. He is focused on developing a fair and humane approach and addressing structural racism for children who wind up in trouble with the law. And I just learned that he and Judge Thorn have worked together for many, many years and have a long and professional relationship. To his immediate left is Judge William Thorn. Judge Thorn has had a long and distinguished career as a judge in Utah, finishing his judicial tenure in 2013 on the Utah Court of Appeals. He is the first Native American appointed to the Utah bench. He has been nationally recognized for his work in helping to establish improved guidelines for judges who are involved in dealing with children in foster care. So he has a lot to bring to the table as well. To his immediate left is Elizabeth Mcnamara. Elizabeth has served 3 terms as president of the U.S. League of Women Voters. She held many other leadership roles during her time with the League, including acting as chair of the Court and Criminal Justice Committee. She also, until her recent retirement, was serving as Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney in charge of the Juvenile Court Division in DeKalb County, Georgia. So she comes with hands-on experience in prosecuting and dealing with the issues involved when young people come into our court system. And then, last but not least, we have Tulio Cardoso. Mr. Cardoso personifies the concepts of life change and second chances. He used his prison experience to move from being an inmate to being an entrepreneur. He learned computer and coding skills while in prison, pretty much, as he told me, self-taught. They have some programs, but not a lot. Once out, he secured a computer-related job, which he parlayed over a little time into creating and leading the first team of incarcerated web developers, meaning he was working with folks who were still in prison at that time. And this is a joint venture between the California Prison Industry Authority and the Last Mile, which is a program which helps transition inmates into the community. He's now working on a reentry app for inmates. So again, bringing some very interesting experience, both in life and in his professional work, to us this afternoon. So welcome to all of you. We're glad you're here. And we're going to start with you, James, giving us sort of an overview.
Thank you. And thanks for you guys that decided to come and check us out this afternoon. So this panel is entitled Pathways to Youth Justice. I don't use the word juvenile because nobody calls their kids juveniles. It's just our little sweethearts. From the time our children are born, We aspire to have them grow up in a loving environment with opportunities for education and play that keep them happy and healthy. As a society, we have an obligation to enhance nurturing and provide supports so that children are able to reach their maximum potential, regardless of skin color, gender, sexual orientation, income, or ability. At the Hayward Burns Institute that I started, we have worked with over 200 counties around the country trying to establish a fair and humane approach for children and young adults in trouble with the law. In each jurisdiction, we endeavor to get human services public sector professionals to construct a system of positive interventions and consequences while maintaining public safety, encouraging school participation, and healthy habits. It seems so simple, those three things. And in some ways it should be, yet issues involving children and young adults that violate prescribed societal norms push deeply embedded buttons. Buttons triggered by molecules deep in our structural DNA that propel us towards punishment, retribution, and distorted notions of accountability. Our professional responses are pregnant with religious beliefs, notions of good versus bad families, sexual mores, and cultural norms, all undergirded by the imperatives of justice. A justice driven by an addiction, and that addiction has always been and remains our societal reliance on incarceration as a primary instrument of social control. Not just for law violators, but misbehaviors in schools and for folks with behavioral health issues. Contrary to general beliefs, youth justice is administered locally in each county or tribal jurisdiction. Thus, the issue regarding pathways to youth justice begins with your community's values. What are the values, hey Judge, what are the values of Boulder County? What are the values of Arapahoe County? Being reflected in how that county administers justice. I will not go into the details of decision-making regarding arrests, detention, and charging, but address what as a body politic is acceptable to you as the civic society. For example, as you sit here, do the people that work in the administration of justice, do they know the minimum age for detention in Boulder County? How young is too young to be locked up? Something a lot of people don't know. Can you lock them up at 8, 12, 7? Are you a strike state? Can you have a youthful strike? Is this a 1 strike, 2 strike, 3 strike state that gives you life imprisonment? These are questions that minimally a professional should know. What are your levels of disparities in this county? Does your police force have a youth division? Does your police force have diversion? Do only the rich counties get diversion and the poor counties not? These are especially pertinent since the purveyors of justice in your county are doing it in your name. In addition, the faces of communities across the nation that are most populous are inexorably changing. Currently, more than half of Americans under the age of 5 are of color. Half of those under 5 in this country are kids of color. More than half of Americans, and by 2044, we will be a majority people of color nation, numerically, across this nation. But while communities of color are driving growth and becoming a larger share of the population, inequality is on the rise and racial and ethnic inequities remain wide, persistent, and generally tolerated as a pathway into the youth justice system. Police Chief Ed Flynn, expressing the sentiments of many police chiefs around the country, he was Milwaukee's police chief, said, and this is a quote from the Chief of Police of Milwaukee, "If you draw an ellipse over our highest crime neighborhoods, you're going to find that those capture the highest percentage of abandoned and foreclosed houses, the highest poverty rates, the highest unemployment rates, and so on." And the problem is that for the last 30 to 40 years, he continues, we have disinvested in mental health services. He didn't say let them go. He said we have disinvested, which means a deliberate decision. In mental health services, we've disinvested in social service, disinvested in virtually everything that folks in these conditions need except the police. 80% of our work, he continues to say, even in our highest crime neighborhoods, is fundamentally social work. This is a brilliant statement of what trauma and adversity looks like increasingly in communities of color. In Freddie Gray in Baltimore, that community that exploded, unemployment 60%. Lead paint with children, 30%. And for those of you out there wanting to invoke the trendy bromide, aha, this is about poverty and not about race. Not so fast, good friends. Data reveals that pathways to youth justice involve a larger shared community value, that children of color, regardless of age and income, are deemed as inherently more dangerous than white youth, thereby necessitating a firmer hand. A UCLA study that I would commend all you to read, entitled The Essence of Innocence by Philip Goff, was quite disturbing in demonstrating that black and Latino boys, it's called Essence of Innocence, you Google it, it'll pull it up, that black and Latino boys were seen as older and more culpable than white boys for the same behavior. Best expressed by Alvin Ransom, a resident of Ferguson, Missouri, while reflecting on the killing of unarmed Michael Brown, saying, "Those of us teenagers that are black, we have to put on a show so that they think we are perfect." This is a very heavy psychic burden to be carrying. I mean, the moniker, hands up, don't shoot, is steeped in a historical legacy of practice that elites and white communities have not had to endure. It may be hard for some to hear, but no agenda regarding pathways into youth justice can ignore the fact that law enforcement agencies, pursuant to our bidding, they're doing what we asked them to do, have been given permission for more than half a century to over-police communities of color. We have given them that permission. We, the larger society, have mostly looked the other way when our emissaries, the police, use the power we have granted them to police communities with the implements of custody, control, suppression, and little else. There is not enough implicit bias training in the world to change this dynamic. Indeed, their mission has been defined as being explicitly biased. Let's take the example of Jaisha Akins in Florida, a 5-year-old black girl handcuffed for throwing a temper tantrum in kindergarten, or the student in South Valley Spring, California, thrown to the ground in her desk and handcuffed for using a cell phone. So how might we respond more positively and effectively? As we sit here today, we have approximately 1 million young people touched by the youth justice apparatus, of which 650,000 will be adjudicated by this court system. Of those, 22% will be sent to some form of placement out of home, and almost 80% of those out-of-home placements will be locked. The overwhelming majority of them are youth of color. So, one, what can we do? Let's develop a professional workforce whose licensure and certification standards include competency on community norms. Develop and implement strategic, 2 minutes, okay? Develop and implement strategic, specific trainings for service providers working in communities that experience adversity more severely and profoundly. Advocate for increased funding for and access to interventions for promising practices. This means engaging individuals and communities most directly impacted by adversity as partners in order to increase empowerment and ownership in affecting change. Why should somebody design dance apparel for some? Shouldn't the people who dance be involved in doing the dance apparel? They need where it needs to give, where it needs to be tight. Why have me do that? I don't know. So we should have the people most impacted by this engaged in it. A key element is promoting approaches that give people and communities the necessities to be motivated from within as we are. Promoting qualities in creativity, leadership, altruism, and civic engagement. So I'll finish by saying we are reaching a critical mass of young people demanding that systems and institutions become transformative rather than merely transactional. We are witnessing folks who have been subject to over 40 years of deliberate disinvestment or insane policies by friends and foes alike who simply don't believe there is a moral arc bending towards a better life for them. So they are disrupting and challenging the status quo in uncomfortable ways. And finally, I'll say an equity agenda takes into account two framing principles. Too often we equate punishment for safety, and the ills of humanity are best cured by more humanity.
Thank you. Judge Thorn.
I'm going to take a slightly different tact. In Indian country, we always teach with stories. So I'm going to give you a couple of stories. But let me give you some background first, is that I learned how to be a judge in a different place than most of my colleagues. I served as a state judge for 27 years, but I learned how to be a judge in tribal courts. Shortly after I had started, this older judge took me aside, put his arm around me and said, "I can see you're having trouble trying to figure out how to do this job." He said, let me give you some advice. He said, the first thing you need to remember is, as a judge, your job is not to sit in judgment of people. And I'm thinking, that's not what they taught me at Stanford Law School. He said, instead, your first responsibility is to treat everybody who walks through those courtroom doors with respect. And then he gave me a test that I could apply to myself. He said, when you're on the bench, imagine that everybody in that audience is your niece, your nephew, your cousin, your sister-in-law, your uncle, or your aunt. Could I go home at night and explain to my grandmother how I treated them? Not did I give them what they wanted, but did I treat them in a way that she would approve of? That's a very different approach than most of my colleagues in state court had. So let me give you a story of how that played out for me as a state trial court judge. I had a situation where a 16-year-old girl was charged as an adult. She had knocked on the door of a woman she didn't know and stabbed the woman 17 times. She pled guilty, and so I was faced with sentencing. What do I do to a then 17-year-old girl? Well, I fell back on my roots of restorative justice. I said, I would like the victim and the little girl to talk to each other. And they said, we can't do that. Well, people like Ted and James who know me, when you tell me I can't do something, that's like supercharging me. So I got volunteers. I got a volunteer mediator who I knew well and trusted. I got my deputies from the courtroom to volunteer their time to provide security. I talked to the defense lawyer. I talked to the prosecutor. The woman had moved out of state because she was afraid. I mean, how scary is that to open the door, see somebody you don't even recognize, and they start stabbing you? So she had moved out of state. The day before sentencing, we arranged for her to come back a day early. And so she and this girl sat down with the mediator and with security at both ends of the room to talk. And we had it set up so that there was a counselor for the victim on call if she needed it afterwards. We tried to take everything into account. And it turned out that this little girl started to tell her story, that apparently she had frenemies who told her that this woman was having an affair with her boyfriend. This 35-year-old woman was having an affair with her 19-year-old boyfriend, who had no contact at all. It was just somebody setting her up. And in a rage, she went over there. And they talked for almost 2 or 3 hours about what life was like. At sentencing the next day, the victim stood up and said, "I'm not afraid anymore. I understand what happened. I certainly don't like it, but I understand it. It's not just out of the blue, crazy violence." And she advocated on behalf of this little girl to get a second chance. But the most moving part was that little girl got up, her turn to talk, and she started crying. Not because she was sorry, because she clearly was sorry, but she was crying because she couldn't believe this woman who had been her victim was speaking up on her behalf. In tears, she was telling me she had never had anybody who spoke on her behalf, and she didn't understand the crazy world that the only person who would ever speak on her behalf was the woman she hurt so badly. So I'm a believer in restorative justice. I'm a believer that for most of you, you all have immigrant roots, which means second chances. That's what this country was built on. Second chances. Kids should not be throwaways. What we know by brain science now, what we know about environment, genetics, epigenetics, the effect of trauma on the wiring of the brain system, the fact that the judgment centers are not formed until you're 27, all of those things say we should not be thinking about throwaway kids. And yet when they get in the system, that's most of what happens. Our lockup system has really become graduate school for crime. Those kids leave with a better network of criminal activity, a better system, and a better understanding than they went in with. We put, unfortunately, minor offenders in with hardened offenders. Our system has just sort of lumped them together. Second thing I want to do quickly is just talk about the pervasive impact of the history that we have. James talked a little bit about the history, but in Indian country in particular, we've had 140 years of breaking families up, intentionally, taking kids out of their homes as young as 4 and sending them to boarding schools. And the boarding schools who had as their avowed purpose stripping the Indian away from the child, separating that child from their family and their culture. Well, what happens when you grow up in a boarding school? Who comforts you when you're sad? Who cheers for you when you do well? When you mess up, who says, "I believe in you"? If you've never been parented, how do you know how to parent? The goal of our system ought to be getting these kids ready to be good parents when it's their turn, not just be, quote, well-being. We've moved out of safety. The progressive have moved to well-being. I don't think that's enough. I think our goal needs to be to break the intergenerational part of this by helping them become good parents. If that's our goal, we make different decisions than if our goal is to lock kids up or to punish them. You can only throw somebody in the river so often and say swim and punish them when they don't before they drown. They're not going to learn to swim. In the tribal setting, that 140 years has created a system where we now lock kids up, despite tribal traditions and despite tribal language that says we want families. I've been working with a program in Mississippi. They're trying to transition out of locking kids up. But what happens is that the youth lockup facility is funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Most cities, if you can convince them to make that transition, you start to transition the employees and the building and the staff to doing community outreach, to doing community work. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs has told them that if you don't want your lockup facility, we'll take the money and we'll put it someplace else. So now they're faced with losing jobs if they don't want to lock their kids up. That's a tough decision to make. And in the communities, when you try and get the elders, in other communities, you've been able to get elders to say, here's how we used to do things. In Mississippi, they have been inundated by the non-Indian system for so long that they have forgotten the traditional systems. When you talk to elders about, well, how would you guide somebody back to the path? They talk about going out and cutting a switch, because that's what they learned in boarding schools for 140 years. So trying to reclaim that. So let me close with just saying, if somebody tells you you can't do it, you have to look at their motive and look at alternatives to do it anyway, if it's the right thing to do. And my experience tells me from 40 years of doing this, no child leaves the system better for being locked up. That could not have been done without locking them up.
Thank you.
Well, first let me say that I worked in the system for nearly 30 years, and obviously I come from a very traditional majority middle class background. I've had just about every advantage you could possibly have, and when I started out in the criminal justice system, I subscribed to an awful lot of the views that a lot of my colleagues subscribe to. And when I left the system 30 years later, particularly having ended my career in juvenile court, I had a very different view of where we are and what we're supposed to be doing. And let me also say that I spent 20 years of my career in the adult system. I ended my career in the juvenile court system, which is actually the right order. It's how you should do things. I completely agree that one of the issues we have, particularly in the juvenile system, is it tends to be where we start people out. They haven't learned their craft, they're learning their trade in probably the most sensitive area we could assign them, and they have absolutely no idea what they're doing. And obviously your incentives as a lawyer is you want to win your case. And that doesn't necessarily sit well in the juvenile system. So ending a career in the juvenile system is frequently the best way to go. Bringing those experiences, my experience as a parent, my experience as a member of the community, my experience in seeing what happened to people that were just passed through the system and ended up in the adult system actually was very, very valuable. The other thing that I want to point out too, and I want to echo James's point, is that our criminal justice system is so diffuse across the country. It is largely organized on the local level. It is predominantly the vast majority of individuals that intersect with the criminal justice system do so in the state court systems as opposed to the federal system. So often the figures and the statistics we get cited, because they're easier to get, are with the federal courts. But the state courts are where the action is, and local communities have a lot more control over what happens in their local courts than they think they do. Courts sort of exist behind a curtain. We don't understand what the law is unless we serve as a juror, and honestly, how many of y'all have ever been called for jury service? Okay. You know, you have that you've got that brief encounter with the system. You maybe don't know any lawyers. You probably don't know anybody who's actually been through the system. And so courts are shrouded in an awful lot of mystery, but honestly, we have an awful lot of local control. I think we've got a lot more local control than we think. I'm going to speak from the point of view of my intersection with the criminal justice system, and that's in DeKalb County, Georgia, which is now, I think, about the third largest county in Georgia. In my lifetime, it has gone from being a rich white bedroom suburb of the city of Atlanta to being a majority minority county with all of those issues, and I'm going to use my air quotes, urban issues, as we tend to say, that plague the criminal justice system in so many different ways. We also have all of my elected officials in my county are African American. My last boss in the district attorney's office was the first African American woman elected countywide to a prosecutor's position, and she brought in her own very unique and very instructive point of view. 3 of the 4 juvenile court judges that I appeared in front of were African American. So most of all of our schools, and I want to talk about schools a good bit in this because schools feature in a lot of the issues that we're having in juvenile court. Most of our schools were 99% African American, and in a lot of schools there were high rates of poverty. So that's my experience with the system. That's to lead into the fact that the reason a lot of this is local and a lot of this are things that you as a community can change, is that a lot of this has to do with resources, and a lot of this has to do with where we put our money and how much money are we willing to spend to do all of this stuff. You're hearing from folks now that are doing this either through the public sector in jobs they already have, or in the private sector almost on a volunteer basis, having to raise money to do these kinds of programs, or hope that there is grant money out there to do these kinds of programs. And I'm here to tell you, as members of a community, as taxpayers, that's wrong. We do put our money into incarceration, and let me tell you why we put our money into incarceration. Believe it or not, the way the number crunchers can work this out, it's actually cheaper in the short run, and your elected officials are only looking at the short run. It's actually cheaper to lock folks up. If you look at the trends from, let's say, I started in the system in the 1980s. By the time we got to the 1980s, after I had graduated from law school, my very first job was with the Administrative Office of the Courts, going around the state of Georgia, flogging a grant to promote alternatives to incarceration in juvenile court, which I thought, this is a no-brainer. I'm coming out of Emory Law School. This is a no-brainer. Not so. Not so when you get outside of metropolitan Atlanta. It was a hard sell not to be locking kids up for all of the reasons that James has just been talking about. Through the 1980s, we were suffering from some crunches in prison systems. A lot of our prisons were under court order. We had to empty them out. The solution in Georgia, because you couldn't ask separately elected Superior Court judges who are Court of General Jurisdictions to impose sentencing guidelines on themselves, was to, for all of those horrible sentences that you read about in the newspapers, to just figure out, have somebody go literally along the axis of a grid in the deep state of the parole system and figure out how many months of that 20-year sentence for burglary that person was actually going to be serving. So we're putting him in the front door, we're letting him out the back door. Why? Because we didn't have the money to keep them. And it became cheaper. It's always cheaper to send somebody home, and it's always even cheaper to send them home with no services and very little supervision, and that's true in the juvenile court system. It's even more true in the juvenile court system. In the 90s, for a variety of reasons, we were flush with cash, and suddenly you're hearing about two strikes laws. You're removing parole from a lot of the most serious offenses. You're willing to lock people up for a very, very long period of time. You're starting to see juveniles charged with certain serious offenses come into the adult system because we weren't capable of thinking of anything else to do but put them in the adult system and solve the problem, again, on the cheap. Now, of course, since the beginning of this century, with a couple of recessions, including the Great Recession, suddenly the most conservative governors in the country are rediscovering drug courts and accountability courts. Because the perception is, and the worrisome thing that this should be for you as community members, is that this sounds really good, this sounds like we're going in the right direction, but the fact of the matter is that treating somebody in the short run is more expensive than locking them up. It's cheaper in the long run, but you're not looking at long run solutions. You're looking at, how do I save money this year? And so yes, you're going to create accountability courts, and juvenile court is should be the primary accountability court in this country. You're going to create drug courts and mental health courts. You're not going to fund them. I promise you, your legislature will not, and your communities will not sufficiently fund them. There will not be. We did boot camps in the early 1990s in order to try and get people out of prison. We did not fund them properly. There wasn't enough bed space. The demand was enormous. The programs kept getting cut and cut and cut, and what was a year-long process of trying to put somebody back in the community started to get to be 2 months, 3 months. So the point, honestly, all we're doing is processing people. But that, honestly, is on all of us as taxpayers, because we're not paying attention to those budgets. We think, wonderful, we've got these laws passed, this is fabulous, we're promoting alternatives to incarceration, but you're not looking at the funding. And the funding is never adequate for what we're doing. The same thing is true on steroids in juvenile court. We went from let's lock everybody up to, from my point of view as a prosecutor, even with kids that were actually pretty dangerous, it was really hard to lock people up. It wasn't hard to detain them. It was easy to keep them in some sort of a facility because their parents couldn't deal with them or there was no place to send them. But locking them up actually was not necessarily that easy, because sending kids home is cheap. Sending them home without services is even cheaper. The state was providing, we were the third largest county in the state, large majority population. James is absolutely right. That is where a lot of our kids, it's out of those neighborhoods that a lot of our kids were coming from. The state was providing $0 to DeKalb County, and the county was not providing anything either, even with the leadership that we had, because it costs money. So pay attention to those budgets, follow that money. The second thing, as I said, I think juvenile courts, honestly, should be accountability courts. I think we need to change the language in juvenile courts. We have been superimposed on the delinquent side all of the rights and privileges, all of the aspects of the adversarial system that we have in adult court. And I'm not suggesting that kids shouldn't have rights and kids shouldn't be protected, but we need to James's point, we need a different code of conduct for folks that are working in juvenile court. The idea here is to figure out what the right consequence is for the decision that a child has made that has had a consequence. What is the correct accountability? What is going to convince that child to grow up and not do this again? This is what we do with our own children. We don't lock them in their rooms until they're 18 years old if they've done something wrong. So again, we need to, in terms of these courts, we need to be looking at, how they're being run. Just two quick points to make. One is my experience is that the schools were probably the largest source of our cases. We need to decriminalize those school conduct codes. If a child gets into a fight with another child, that child has not committed a simple battery. That child has gotten into a fight with another child. As I said, most of our schools were predominantly African American with African American leadership. We need to get the police departments out of our schools. We have a whole police department in my school system. It is very easy for a principal that is under stress to frog march a kid out of school in handcuffs because there's a police officer right there available to help him do it. And again, if you want to stop that school to prison pipeline, start thinking about those school conduct codes. You as a community have some opportunity for that. And the other thing, and I think that this is the point that James was making, and I agree with it absolutely, is our courts are not designed to do social engineering. They are not designed for good or for bad. They shouldn't be used. Honestly, I don't believe that they're designed or they're intended to reduce the crime rate. This is not what courts are for. Courts are supposed to be dealing with the individual transgressions of those that come before them. When we use them to do the social engineering, whether it is to try and reduce crime in this community, or sadly in the reverse, to undo generations of structural issues involving minority populations, then we are misusing the courts. But again, it's cheap, it's easier to do, and that's the logical place to go. We intervene too late with kids, and we intervene for the wrong reasons, and we intervene in the wrong place. And you as a community have got the power to talk to your elected officials and say, this has got to stop, we've got to do something better.
Thank you.
So my viewpoint on this is really as a consumer of the services, of the framework, of the established practice that are in place right now in the criminal justice system. Before I roll into it, I just want to say as an employer, which is really my role right now in this whole framework, I wish that I felt that the impact and procedure that Judge Thorn is advocating for was more predominantly viewed as the right way to do this across America. I'll tell you why. Developers have this expression. It says the best line of code is the one you didn't have to write. It's because it's the one that doesn't have bugs, you don't have to maintain it, et cetera, et cetera. For me, hiring people for a livable wage, as I said earlier, $16.49 an hour inside of prisons. If you missed that talk, I'm happy to talk about it later. I would find it that the best employee that I could hire is the one that I never really did have to hire. I don't want to hire anybody in a prison. And right now, my workforce consists of 66% people who started their experience in the criminal justice system as a juvenile. So literally, most of the people that I employ have never, they've had two forms of ID, a prison ID and maybe a school ID. They've never interviewed for a job. They have absolutely zero experience with what it takes to communicate what got them there. And more often than not, they'll have some education, but the reality is that they need a lot more to go. And they need mentorship, they need people to believe in them, and they need an opportunity to believe in themselves. So I was deeply moved when that's what I heard. Your belief is give an opportunity to, Judge Thorn, giving people an opportunity to communicate with the people who they hurt and at least give those victims an opportunity to be heard as well. And if something happens where that person can be moved differently, I think that's a wonderful thing. And I hope that that prevents me from having to hire that person in the future. So, for my question, my viewpoint is how do we prevent people from coming out of the juvenile justice department and moving into the adult prison system? As I said, it's unfortunate truth that the majority of the people fall into two categories. Either they've been incarcerated at age 15 or thereabouts, or there's somebody who's been incarcerated as a career criminal, and when I come across them, they at least feel that their way wasn't the right way, and now they're ready to at least try something, anything. So I'm just deeply curious on finding new approaches to it. Within my line of work, I have come across a couple of companies that I'd like to highlight what they're doing and what we're also very lucky to help them with, and that is to try to figure out how to incorporate technology into the reentry process and into the supportive process. In our work in trying to work in the juvenile justice system, one of the implications that this involves is having to work with a population of people. It's important to remember they're people that have a high predisposition to having disciplinary infractions while incarcerated for whatever reason. They have a high turnover, and it's a very difficult thing for us as a service provider or us as an employer to be able to work with a group that is changing so often. So for this newer technology or this newer generation of people, I think technology is potentially the right approach at being able to systemize, being able to productize support structures, accountability circles, community involvement in people that are currently incarcerated. And while that does sound a little bit like pie in the sky, I just want to remind all of you right now that there are companies that specialize in bringing technology into the hands of people who are currently incarcerated. I'll give you a quick example. I'm not sure how many people in here have watched that new series on Netflix it's in Indiana with a women's prison. It's not one that we're working with, but the thing I want to highlight is if you looked at that show, you'll notice that the inmates have a Wi-Fi tablet, and it's actually a 4G LTE connected tablet. And the company behind that particular tablet is able to pipe content directly in to the hands of the people that are currently housed in those facilities. And the additional thing that they're doing is they're using machine learning assessment techniques to find out, like, hey, what is your background? What is your goal? What does success look like for you in 5 years? What are you trying to do? Where are you at now? Can you read? Can you write? And provide them those opportunities to do those things. So my question for you as community members is, would you not only like to have the CWA app on your phones, but wouldn't you also like to have an app on your phone that allows you to support people that are incarcerated in your current juvenile justice system? It's totally possible, and I believe that even those apps, those technology platforms are rolled out across the United States already. So I think that that's a question that we need to ask ourselves about society, because there's definitely that intersection of is it a cost, an expense that's cost effective, and in the short term, I think that it definitely is more expensive as taxpayers to take up these opportunities. But as an employer, in technology, I realize that I have a problem hiring people. I can't get enough qualified individuals. I realize that the majority of my particular workforce is incarcerated, but we also have operations on the outside, and it's really, really, really tough to hire at market wages for the positions we're trying to fill within ourselves. The competition is just so stiff. And that's really why I would like to think about, like, what are those ways we can continue to bring back the community. Juveniles are too young of a workforce to throw away, too young of a workforce to not give a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth opportunity. I'm the father of 2 wonderful daughters, one age 10, one age 16, and I can tell you, as I'm sure some people in here are parents, those are ages where you know that it's a challenge, right? There's many different things that you go through, and I never give up on my children, no matter how hard or how challenging they test me. And I think that that's a really important thing to realize is as communities, we really, those are somebody else's nieces, nephews, uncles, brothers. Those are people in our community. We really need to make sure that we're providing the same opportunity as we would to our own children or to our own parents. You know, their parents are incarcerated. I employ some of those as well. I know this is really a factor of juveniles, but that's really my perspective on this. I would like to see more people get out, stay out, and never have to hire them. The number that you were speaking about, James, earlier, 1 million people are being touched by the juvenile justice system. I totally believe that, and I'm really disappointed that I have to have hired some of the 600,000 people that were adjudicated. So yeah. I'll keep it short, but that's really, that's for me as an individual community member, a taxpaying member, a hiring force. And I want to just mention too, like, not only do I work with the last mile, but previously I ran my own company, had 5 people that were working for me, all formerly incarcerated, some since juvenile age. Like, I realize, like, this is something I need as an employer, and I'm sure you need as a community, a group of community members for your own communities. So, thanks.
Thank you. Well, now I'm going to give panel members an opportunity to comment or respond to anything they have heard, if anyone is so moved to do that. Judge, go ahead.
I wanted to just indicate that I disagree with Elizabeth on one point, and that's the role of the juvenile courts. I think juvenile courts are uniquely situated to be part of the solution. Bringing people into the court is not part of the solution. But the courts, when judges call meetings, people show up. When judges identify needs and challenge people to fill those needs, people start to step up. If we got local juvenile judges to say, here's a gap, whether it's, as you said, in the schools or it's someplace else, called the meeting, a handful of leaders in the community, and say, these are the neighbors for our children in the future. We have a responsibility from self-interest, as well as the fact that they really are our families, to help. I think juvenile courts have a role in doing that. And I think it's different than the role of adult judges. Second, one of the highest correlates of people in prison is coming out of foster care, which means that we ought to look not just at the juvenile system, but we ought to look at what happens to those kids before they get to the juvenile system and say, if they were my kids, my grandkids, what would I want done? Because it's hard to have any professional integrity when you say, I demand this for mine, but yours are okay with just that. If we were to apply that standard, if they were our family, what would we demand for them?
And let me just say, I totally agree with you, which is why I think that juvenile courts need to be more accountability courts, that we need to have that special code of conduct for juvenile courts. And courts where judges have done exactly what you're suggesting have been very successful in moving the conversation. I was unfortunate I didn't happen to work in a court where the judges were willing to do that. They complained a lot behind the scenes, and this again is where we put judges in kind of awkward positions. Look at how you should also be looking at how your juvenile court judges are selected. Do you even have juvenile court judges? Not a lot of places in the country they don't. Our judges were appointed by our superior court judges who were elected. So making waves may have meant you weren't going to get reappointed, and they were doing good work. So I have a lot of respect for juvenile court judges in that regard. I also agree that, again, we have such a fragmented system. For example, in our juvenile court, we had two different sides. You had the delinquent side, which is where I got involved, but you also had we have a new juvenile court code. I don't know what we're calling it now, but it was the deprived side. It was where the kids went into foster court. The judges were aware of where the twain were meeting, but the jurisdictions did not necessarily allow them to be working with the families and the kids all at the same time. My point with all of you all is that your voters, or your community members, you've got some influence on this. You don't have to accept this. These are decisions that are made by lawmakers that you have some input with. So understanding your local system, understanding how this is working, and understanding that I think we're all saying the same thing here, that this is complicated and that there are a lot better ways of looking at this if we just get together and talk about it, is absolutely something that you've got a lot more control over than I think you do.
Okay, I want to move to question and answer, and unfortunately my laptop is not allowing me to access the apps that some of you may have. So we're going to the old-fashioned note card. So I'm going to ask the producers to pass out note cards to anybody who raises their hand, and would ask you to write out your question for me. They will be brought up to me to read. That's our sort of new process that the CWA has instituted. And so if anybody has a question, please put your hand up and someone will come and bring you a note card. Up high enough so we can see it. Okay, thank you. And then while those cards are coming and you're writing your questions out, oh, and by the way, please write legibly so that I can read it, and make your question as succinct and to the point as possible. While we're waiting for those questions to come up, I have a question for the panel. We've heard a lot of different ideas from all of you about ways in which we might address not only the juvenile or youth system, justice system, but also our schools and the way in which they connect and other, I would suspect, institutions or organizations in our community. If, this is one of those if questions, if you had the resources and you had the political support, what one or two approaches would you put your money on? I would be curious to know, because you've given us some great ideas today, but I'd love to know if you had the chance to take one or two things.
With schools?
Could be with schools, it could be with the courts, it could be, because we've touched on those institutions here, but where would you put that money, given that you would have the political support and you'd have resources? So,
I really appreciate the notion that we as a society are asking the courts and the judicial system and actually law enforcement to do more than they've thought. So what Judge Thorn is talking about is accessing the power of the courts to begin to get people to do what they should have done before it came to court, right? So our mental health system, if you're violent, we're going to figure out a way to arrest you. In school, if you're disruptive, we're going to figure out a way to get you with a school resource officer. And so we're continuing to use the justice system as the dumping ground for other failed systems. And that, to me, is, that's what happens for poor people. See, when Chad and Everett get in a fight in the country day school, they don't go to the police because those parents are paying $40,000 a year for tolerance, not zero tolerance. In the public schools, you get zero tolerance. In the country day school, you get tolerance, and it's called, free expression. So what we're trying to do is to say, and this is particularly true in communities of color, is that what we need are services available to those communities. And that means, and unfortunately the way that is all those failures go to the court, and enlightened courts then say, excuse me, I only got two options. I've got jail, or I can let you go. What I'm going to do is what Judge Thorn has talked about, is I'm going to kind of get you guys together to do your job. To do your job.
So that's, okay, so
And
that's where you
that
would
to me, but my position is, in line with Ms. Mcnamara, is I would try to begin to starve that bureaucratic beast before they get them. That the monies are sent other places first. So that, in fact, that the monies are going elsewhere that have a better chance of serving them.
Great. Anybody else want to make a comment, or I'll go straight to some questions?
There's a great deal of research out there with schools that show that kids do better in safe environments, but it's not safe as we normally think about no criminal behavior. It's safe in terms of the principal knows your name when you're walking down the hall. The teachers know you. You have a reason to come to school. It's a welcoming environment. It's a fun environment where you learn, you get to hang out with your friends, you do interesting things. That is the environment. When we have places that criminalize normative behavior. I mean, it's normal for kids to skip school. It's normal for kids to get in a scuffle. It's normal for kids to drink. It's normal for kids to do stuff they shouldn't be doing. But that doesn't mean we ought to be making it a crime, and we shouldn't be making them labeled a gang because they're doing it with their friends. So part of it is understanding that we shouldn't be normalizing, we shouldn't be criminalizing normative youth behavior.
And I would say, too, that when I say that we intervene too late and we intervene for the wrong reasons, you know, children that are in stressful environments, and there are a lot of different reasons for kids being in stressful environments. Most of them are, at least in my experience, are perfectly normal. They're parents that are having to work multiple jobs. They're single parents. They're just, for all of the reasons that we talk about in terms of where we have been historically throughout our history. These are kids that whose parents are not able to give them what I, for example, was able to give my son when he got in trouble at school, and believe me, he got in trouble at school. And that was, I could give him, and I could give the school my time. I could show up and back the school up, and we could come up with that solution, which is how our schools are structured, and honestly, that's how our juvenile court system is structured. We depend on parents to be the ultimate probation officer, and a lot of parents with kids that end up in the system just are not able to do that, and it's not because they don't love their children. It's because they just can't do it. So I would love to see some more resources going into more support for families in stress. Parenting is something, again, that doesn't come on the X or the Y chromosome. It's something that you learn from your parents. We started seeing a lot of kids at 13 in juvenile court because that's when they were able to hit their mother back. You know, if you're under a lot of stress and the norms of the way you've been raised up, you know, is spare the rod, spoil the child, then that's the parenting tool that you know to use. Does that mean that parents aren't willing to learn other parenting tools? Of course not, but you need a community support for that. We can provide that community support. We can be looking at visiting nurses programs that can come in and help parents. I know my first grandbaby was born in Texas in November, and both her parents are working, and they're finding out, even though they have resources, how important it is to have a family network around and to have other resources beyond your immediate parents. Some kids have that, some kids don't, but we have communities around that. And my experience is that we will find that community, and sometimes that community isn't always necessarily safe.
Elizabeth,
so that's where I would put my
I may
money.
interrupt. We've got some
Yeah,
questions,
I'm
so I want to
sorry.
make, no, that's fine. I mean, these are all good points. Let me read a couple of these so we can get them in before we have to vacate this lovely room. First question, as voting community members, how do we find out or know which judges are not open to changing the court's approach to juveniles so we can vote in new judges? Are there sources of information in your communities that tell you about judges, or you have an opportunity to learn about them?
I don't know of sources, but the question that I think people should be asking
Okay.
is, what activities are you involved in when you're not in the courtroom? If your activities are, I go to the country club, I race motorcycles, that's one thing. If your activities are, I volunteer at the shelter, I serve at the food pantry, you get a different kind of approach. And that's not to say that those are bad people, but if you want juvenile judges who are oriented towards the community and helping find solutions, that's the question I would ask.
Okay. And I know that in some states, Colorado is one where we have judicial performance commissions, and so you can get information as a voter that will allow you to have at least some more details other than what you might have heard anecdotally about judges.
I would say something else as well. This notion that it is not a system is so true. It is a semi-autonomous collection of independent people. The DA can't tell the police what to do.
No.
The police can't tell the judge what to do.
Right.
The public defender can't tell the prosecutor what to do. The prosecutor can't tell probation what to do. So you have all of these people that have their hands in the pot, and all of them have a different job, and none of those jobs are responsible to anybody else. There's nobody that says, I'm in charge. And people think the judges are in charge, and the judges aren't. The judges can't tell the public defenders what to do. And so my sense is, when those agencies come to the Board of Supervisors or your county commission to get their money, when they get their paycheck annually, show up at those meetings, and those are the questions to say, how many cases did you process a year? What is your budget? How many people, how many young people did you send to the adult system? How many did we send to the youth correction system? And so there, I think, is where you get accountability, and talk to the supervisor who represents you that can also ask that system those questions.
Great, great. Here's another question for the whole panel. What's the most important program in schools to decrease the school-to-prison pipeline? What aspects of the school system need the most work?
I think part of it is that decriminalizing normative behavior. But the other part is getting the family involved. We all know, for example, that truancy leads to dropouts, and your life trajectory is like this. So judges say, okay, I'm going to solve the truancy problem. I'm going to lock those kids up if they won't go to school. Then the life trajectory goes like that. So how do you solve that? Well, there's been several programs now that when the norm is when you miss 20 days of school, you lose credit and you get kicked out. Well, 20 days turns out to be about 10% of the school year. So the program is that anytime you miss 10% of the days, somebody goes to visit your house.
Correct.
In the first 2 weeks, if you miss one day, somebody's at your house, not threatening you, not giving you a hard time, but simply saying, Johnny wasn't there, how can we help? If Johnny's just simply sick, that's okay. But if Johnny's not there because of something else, you get involved then. In the first month, if they've missed 2 days, somebody's at their house. You don't wait for the point to get to a crisis where even if you get the kid back, then he says, why bother? I'm not going to get credit. You get involved early, and you get the family involved as a partnership.
If I can follow up on
Sure.
truancy, because I think truancy is one of the first signs that there is a problem. We don't pay enough attention to what we used to call status offenses in juvenile court: runaways, truancy, the things that you can only do because you happen to be of a certain age. That is also a community issue. This is not something that, this is not just, yes, get the parents involved, don't wait for the truant officer to be there. If, communities that have gotten the whole business community involved and identifying kids and have done training with police departments as to how to respond to this have had pretty good luck with truancy. But paying attention to truancy, but again, that is a whole community response. Basically, if you see a kid hanging around that looks like he ought to be in school, there should be some point at which, without getting the kid locked up, you should be able to report and get some kind of an intervention.
Let me give an example of exactly that kind of thinking. At the Umatilla Reservation, they're having problems with getting kids to school, particularly on Monday mornings. Parents would have a rough weekend, they wouldn't get up, the kids didn't get to school. They didn't have any money to spend, they didn't have any programs or resources, so they got together basically to talk about what can we do different. They came up with the idea, well, and they're not neighborhood schools there, schools are a long ways away. So how do the kids get there? Came up with a program where you call the police department. The police officer will drive to the house, call the kid, and say, I'm outside, come on in. The officer's not to have any contact with the parents. The officer's not to belittle anybody or harass anybody. They simply give them a ride to school.
Yeah.
What the byproduct of that was that two things. One is after 3 or 4 times, the parents were embarrassed. I don't want the police officer to take my kids to school. That looks bad. So they find themselves getting up. But the second product was the kids form a relationship with the officer.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the officers know a lot more about what's going on in the community than they ever did before. It's a win-win-win if you can think about reprogramming what you have to do a service to people rather than to be a watchdog on people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to say something about that. I want to broaden that out. Oftentimes, this is adults that have created these horrible systems, and they put all the burden on the young people. It's like, you're not going to school. Well, actually, if you went to my school, would you go? I mean, at some point, what we need to do at Burns, we call it smalling it down. I love what Judge Thorn just said about that kind of program. What I would say is, we're giving these solutions which sound to you like it's too much. I don't have the power, I don't have the time, I'm trying to. But if you identify the high school in your community that has the most truancies, has the most whatevers, then what we can do is say, and what is the reason, right? How is it that we can then engage with that high school principal to try to say that? And one of the first things is, as Judge Thorn says, is this a high school that you would want your child to go to, right? How many teachers at many of these at these schools would say, I wouldn't send my kid to the school I'm teaching at? What does that tell you? Then the children are making actually a decent decision to stay home and couch surf than rather go to a place where they're actually not, there are no AP courses, there's no way they can be competitive, it's probably violent or whatever. And so they're making a decent choice to say, I'm trying to avoid that place. And if you were them, you would probably be making similar choices. So let's get accountability, not just with the kids, but the adults that are supposed to be serving them as well.
All right, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to get, there's a question specifically for Tulio, so I want to get
Yes.
that question in. What do corporate employers say when you ask them to employ released offenders? How do you handle that sort of delicate issue?
Sure. So to be very frank, we haven't had any negative feedback from anybody who's interested in hiring. The main concern they want to know is can the individuals actually do the job?
Can they go?
Yeah. And that's really the bottom line. Now, with that, one of the ways that we've been helping to support that is giving them the code that the inmates have been writing, that the people have been writing. So in the tech industry, you're not judged by your past. Basically, you're judged by the quality of your code. Like, can you really do it? So the way that it works is you all heard of Google Docs. You can save it. We can save their work, and we can provide it to the employers to assess, to look at. And in fact, there are many tools that will help folks, even if they're offline like ours are, to improve that quality. And we're utilizing that so that when they get out, they really have that solid understanding. And we've had absolutely a wonderful, wonderful experience with employers. Like I said, I might not have said in this panel, every one of our 45 participants that have gone through either the educational component or the joint venture with the state of California on the business side, all 45 of them are either employed full-time or in educational opportunities. We've had zero recidivism. So
Wow, that's great. We are just about on our time, and I've got two things I want to say. First off, I'm very sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. I got to most of them, but not all of them. Second, I've got an announcement here about the jazz concert, which is tomorrow night. And it is that, for those who aren't aware, it will be occurring Tuesday night, Mackey. This is an amazing free concert by professional world-class jazz musicians. Those of you who've gone before know this to be true. I can attest to that. If you do not have a ticket, you can arrive at Mackey at 7:30 when we will distribute any unclaimed tickets. So if you don't already have one, they're gone, but there may be people who don't claim them. So then I just want to end by thanking our wonderful panel for a very interesting and informative discussion. And all of you for being here and participating in this. And I hope you continue to participate in the rest of what is a wonderful conference. Oh my gosh.